Egypt is usually talked about like this isolated area in which people stayed stuck to the Nile and could not find any other place around the world. Now, given the fact that they imported wood from Lebanon and the fact that they imported all kinds of materials from Africa, we would think that this would be a dead idea, especially with scholars. But scholars still believe in the idea of the Nile being the gift to Egypt. When in real life, we know that Egyptians traveled all over the world, even as far as India, and they did this for various reasons. One, curiosity. Two, because Egypt did not really regard itself as unable or unwilling to adapt new ideas. These travels around the world from the Egyptians, ancient Egyptians, was so frequent that even females and children would travel along the journeys. It wasn't military men or kings necessarily. Of course, we have things that go as far back as the Mitanni, where we see direct communication, where the Mitanni are asking for people to be sent to their lands in Arabia. And of course, the ancient Egyptians reply with positivity and give it to them. But this isn't the only time that this has happened. Of course, the Mitanni as well would send some of their people into Egypt, and they both benefited from that exchange. But if we keep looking further, we will find that there are actually names and everything of females and males who traveled to Arabia and traveled to the Sudan and traveled even lower.
Now, the other thing, when I was an undergraduate, I wondered about was we know a great deal about European travelers who came to Egypt from the Crusaders onwards, and they left descriptions of Egyptian monuments sometimes. Sometimes they took the monuments with them back home. And no mention was ever made of Arab travelers or Arab people interested in archaeology, etc. Yet it's funny because Arabs were known already in ancient Egypt in their thousands. There were large Arab communities living in ancient Egypt, working in ancient Egypt. We have dozens of names of Egyptian priests with Arab names like Khalid, Ragab, Ali, Abdu. And we have also developed some kind of myth in Egyptology that have no real basis. We were told as undergraduates that ancient Egyptian refused to let their women travel abroad and marry foreigners. Nothing could be further from the truth. Egyptian women were quite happy all the time, even now, to go out and marry in Saudi Arabia or in Kuwait or in the Gulf, wherever. And we have a list of dozens of such Egyptian women marrying, Taima in the east of Saudi Arabia, this beautiful oasis, and several areas around it were really very Egyptianized. We have Egyptian monuments found there, Egyptian stelas. The cult of Isis and Osiris was very common in the east of Saudi Arabia. The west of Saudi Arabia, east for us, the western part of Saudi Arabia on the Red Sea area. And we have names of Egyptian women. They were Egyptian women, but actually, if you look at their names, Bidur, Taima, Tamiya, all these are beautiful Arab names of Egyptian women who left Egypt and married and worked and lived in Saudi Arabia.
Now, given how close Saudi Arabia is, you would think that people would already know this. In fact, you would think that people from Saudi Arabia were known back in the day, which I have shown thousands of videos of this. I don't think I have to show it anymore. That people from Eritrea, Ethiopia, both tribal and sophisticated, made their way to Saudi Arabia. And so it would be, I don't know, like stealing candy from a baby. That's the only saying I can think of right now. It would be easy for people like the Egyptians who had large boats, large sea traveling boats that could go from place to place, that even took journeys as far as Ethiopia. The idea that they couldn't just cross the Red Sea, I mean, I don't understand why it would take such a hard level of understanding. In fact, I even say that a lot of Saudi Arabian tradition from back then was probably influenced highly by ancient Egypt, especially if you go lower and lower to Yemen and you start seeing the Sabaean Empire. The Sabaean Empire shows hardcore uh, influence from ancient Egypt. Remember, by the time of Xerxes, we know that the people of all, the whole world were pretty much discovered and put into place as to where they were, who they were, and what they look like in this famous thing, which are, well, historians call the Table of Races. Now, it's not necessarily a table of races because they don't really separate them by race, but instead they separate them by military faction. As you can see, all the men depicted here are military men. And these military men do not represent necessarily the entire race of the population living there, but instead represent the strongest and utilized by Xerxes and Darius. If we look at the top, of course, they represent the East, which would be the West to them because the map was upside down. But the East, as you can see, Persian, Medians, Elamites, Parthians, Aryans, Bactrians, Sogdians, Khwarezmian, Zarangian, Arakosian, Satagdian, Gandharian, Hindush, and Sakahamavarga. And of course, at the bottom, you have the Westerners from Ethiopians all the way to Babylonians, Arabs, Assyrians, Lydians, and so on. In fact, one of them are the Ionians, which were people who, by the time of, again, Xerxes, these Ionians were people who came from Europe and landed up in the Arabian areas. So, what does this have to do with anything? Well, it tells you that not only were these people not isolated, but they were easy to connect. And even before the time of Darius and before the time of Xerxes and the Persian Empire in general, these people had constant communication with the kings in order to keep peace, whether it be by trade or whether it be by military. In other words, you send people there to threaten them and say don't come near our borders except for good intentions. Now, don't get me wrong, these two empires, well, these two locations, Africa and Asia, had two completely different histories. For example, the ancient Egyptians, when, let's look at about 2300 BC, they had their own kings and queens and stuff. And of course, there were people coming from Arabia at that time, but they had their own complete history that was independent and really did not care that much about any other place outside, with a very minimal, let's say, one or two words difference based on people coming from Kush or Kish. Now, what is Kish? Kish is the Akkadian word for Sumeria. These two have been mistaken for each other for a while by people who don't understand. Now, Kish is Kisatu. That's what they used to call it, or Kisutu, or Kisatu, as the Akkadians used to call it. But these two had gods that had nothing to do with each other. For example, the Akkadians worshipped Anu, whereas really the Egyptians didn't have a main deity, and even when they did, it would be someone who has not no name close to Anu. Now you will notice that the Akkadians, in almost all ways, represented Arabs in their facial features and everything, while the Egyptians sort of represented a more African look. Now let's first talk about who we can say almost for a fact, and there's a reason why I'm saying almost for a fact, established the first real big trade with Egypt, and it was probably Sargon of Akkad. Evidence of trade with Sumeria is very small, and when the Akkadians took over and basically established the Akkadian Empire, they were so close to Egypt that the guess is that they must have had traded with these people, especially that we find things that seem to only show up in certain places. Now, one of the things that people don't talk about is the fact that ancient Egyptian had wood of their own. They had trees of their own. Of course, if you're moving giant blocks, that's very important. But one of the things that is told to a lot of people is that a lot of these trees came from outside of Egypt, and certainly some of them did. But like I said, they had some of their own. Let's read, for example, this. The hyper-arid climate of the desert in Egypt is perfect for preserving wood. Although Egypt has no forest today, there were wooded areas in antiquity, and despite a lack of larger strong timbers, there were active industries of carpentry, including boat making. There is no other ancient civilization from which so many wooden artifacts have survived. Well, it's a pretty interesting fact, thinking that the nations that have imported or have exported wood to Egypt wouldn't have more wooden artifacts survive. I mean, we do know that places like Acadia and places like that had a lot of carpenters. I mean, one of the most famous carpenters is from the Canaanite areas or Israel. But still, in this time period, we find nothing but speculation of, again, based on what is found. For example, copper, they say, comes from the Indus Valley, which is true. Then they say gold and silver and other precious metals come from Egypt and Asia Minor. Now, I have to stress, there is no real proof that far back that the gold was coming from Egypt, because we know there was a lot of gold coming from other places in Asia proper, like the Turkish areas, it's like stuff places like Turkmenistan or whatever the hell, and of course, yeah, Asia Minor, and then wood coming from the Levant and Elam, and which was later Persia, and then lapis lazuli coming from ancient Afghanistan. These are the things that were traded to Mesopotamia. Now, the reason why they say gold is because, of course, Egypt had gold, but we don't know. What we do know, though, about who actually traded with the ancient Egyptians were the Nubians, the Sudanese, the Ethiopians, and, of course, by extension, other Africans, including those who are situated in the Congo. Now, why could I say this? Well, because, of course, through a great network of trade, people from the Congo who had invented the Basenji dog, eventually their dog made its way into Egypt, and very ancient, way before the date that the Sumerians started communicating with ancient Egyptians with real evidence. As you can see, the dog of choice in Sumeria was very different. It was a hound. This hound, as you can see, was very dangerous looking. Now, there are easy differences to spot with this dog, but I'll point them out anyway, even though it's so easy. One, the Basenji is very small compared to their dog. And then, secondly, their dog is very fierce and muscle based. This, if they communicated with the ancient Egyptians, would have been highly favored as an animal. I see this as proof that they didn't have real communication at the time. Dogs that had been established outside of Africa seemed to not be very popular inside of Africa, or they were just unaware of their existence. Now, of course, the reason why this Basenji is very important is because it's a completely unique breed to Africa and it's spread all over Africa. But it's unique in a deeper sense, in the sense that it does not come from the wolves that so many other dogs come from outside of Africa, meaning there is no mixing whatsoever. This period from 3000 BC, or prehistoric era, to the early Bronze Age, we know that there was barely, if any, contact with Europeans, Middle Easterners, or any other group. It really started at about 1700 BC, the communication between the Middle East and the African civilizations. And for a fact, we know that this happened with so many other civilizations at the time. They went from barely any contact to a lot of contact outside of Africa. While with Africans, they had been contacting them since prehistoric times. Of course, because Egypt is in Africa, this makes a lot of sense. The Sumerians, on the other hand, have been speculated to have known about Africa since they were first established, but there is no proof of this. In fact, maps made by the Sumerians do not even indicate their knowledge of another continent outside of their own. This would make us think that the best evidence right now is that there is no true establishment between these two places. Some statues that look like they come from Sumeria have been found in very early Egyptian times, but again, this is very small evidence. Now, it may seem like I have put a good point out for why these civilizations probably had nothing to do with each other for thousands of years, but there is still another problem: the Afro-Asiatic language. Though the ancient Egyptian language is the first Afro-Asiatic language written down, meaning that it's easily the oldest by assumption than almost all the others, the Akkadian language from 2000 BC and backwards is still the second oldest written Afro-Asiatic language. So, what is an Afro-Asiatic language doing in a kingdom far, far away that almost has nothing to do with ancient Egypt? And why is it that they speak with such similar words to the point that if you just sit there and compare these words, you can easily establish similarities and just go, okay, that word is that word, that word is that word. But we're talking about no proof outside of this of similarities. This might be the language, the earliest proof we have that these civilizations did in fact have some very minimal contact, and that the nations that lay in between them were probably aware of both of them, though they were not aware of each other. So, of course, what we should do is we should just get our dictionaries out, look up Akkadian words, and look up Egyptian words, and it's that simple, right? Not really, because of a lot of Akkadian words actually come from Sumerian words. Sumerian is a language isolate, meaning that it has nothing to do with the ancient Egyptian language or any other Afroasiatic language. But there are some words that look similar in the Sumerian language to the Egyptian language. This is called coincidence. It gets harder when you consider the fact that Sumerian, as the years go on, starts to adopt Akkadian words. So some Afroasiatic words blend into the language, and now it becomes almost impossible to separate borrowing from coincidence from actual words. But the fact that it took the Akkadians to move the Afroasiatic language there tells me that this language was not Semitic in origin. It also tells me that the Semitic people probably had a whole bunch of languages at the time. Because, of course, the Sumerian language, being a language isolate, is fine, but the Indus Valley is right there. Iran is right there. Okay, so let's quickly talk about what I'm trying to say. So, 1600 BC, we start having people from the Middle East moving into the Egyptian areas. Before that, we really see no evidence of that whatsoever, even though I believe that some people, obviously, from those places came in. Now, before that, the evidence for more people coming in is almost there. But let's take another look deeper than this, which is they say that farming must have come from outside of Egypt in order to become Egyptian. And I kind of agree. Yes, it did come from outside, but it came from other parts of Africa. We know that from 8000 BC, we already have cattle in parts like North Africa, Chad, Sudan, and other local areas. This crushes any idea that you need some foreign force to come in and change everything. This crushing also happened in the case of these type of depictions that have horns on them, and of course cattle depictions from the Enendi area. Now, what should we do with this information? Well, it's still debated to this day how many people from the Middle East came as early as 8000 BC, as early as 4000 BC, as early as 2000 BC. But it seems like their impact is very minimal if you consider all the evidence and how much the ancient Egyptians don't seem to care about innovations that are happening outside of Africa. In conclusion, people play with their close neighbors, not their distant neighbors. And we can see this when the Sabaeans later on, at about 600 AD, not 600 AD, at about 50 BC, and those times, they start moving to places in Africa because they're right there. And people from Africa move into the Sabaean areas because they're right there. The people in Sumeria, they're with the Iranians and the Indians because they're right there. It isn't hard to say why the people of those regions have nothing to do with Egypt, at least not in the same exaggerated way that the Africans do. But let's play a game called How Many Years Removed. Let's say it is true what they say that 10,000 BC Middle Easterners moved into Africa and they completely overwhelmed those regions, and then that's what happened. But then we see this isolation happening after that. Those people in real life would not be Middle Eastern. If you're isolated for thousands, 4, 5, 6, 7,000 years from the Middle East, then the Middle East really doesn't affect you at all after that. Not as much as Africa is. Those people would have eventually become African in all ways, except maybe their DNA. In fact, probably that too. But what about the contact with the Minoans? Well, that's well after the 1600 BC mark that I gave. Again, contact outside of Africa, not that big. Contact inside of Africa, the biggest. North African civilizations, East African civilizations, South African civilizations, and everybody else is mainly affected by African civilizations. And that will never change.